Hi Year 12, welcome back, and this is the Historical Notes video 2, and at the end of our last session we left off with this quote by Professor Pissotto: "Our job is not to censure but to understand," which was met with applause, and we discussed the whole idea of the danger of liberal tolerance, particularly extreme liberal tolerance and appeasement. So the section that we're about to move into now is filled with a lot more factual information regarding Offred and her experiences and some of the other characters. And so we're just going to get stuck in and look at a few things in more detail. So after this comment, he states, "To return from my digression," and of course the significance there being that his views about morality and ethics are a digression from his main interest, his main points, which is the discussion of this historical artifact. Tape like this, however, is very difficult to fake convincingly. We are assured by the experts who examined them that the physical objects themselves are genuine. And as we go through much of this discussion, and we mentioned it when we read the first section of the historical notes, the objects, the artifacts themselves are of greater significance to Pissotto than any of Offred's story. And as we go through this section, we want to take close care to look at this kind of scientific, academic, clinical dealing with a story that we have been intimately acquainted with on a personal, emotional level, and to consider what Atwood is doing with this shift in register to treat things in such a clinical, academic way, where we have been used to having alignment and connection and emotion with regards. So the physical objects themselves are genuine. Certainly the recording itself, that is, the superimposition of the voice upon music tape, could not have been done within the past 150 years. And so we have this revelation of this advancement, that this technology wouldn't have been available. And so it must have been from the contemporary period to Gilead that they were created. Supposing then the tapes are genuine, what of the nature of the account itself? Obviously, it could not have been recorded during the period of time that it recounts, since, if the author is telling the truth, no machine or tapes would have been available to her, nor would she have had a place of concealment for them. And so here we have the first commentary on Offred's story, if the author herself is telling the truth. And we have this sense of unease that's created here, where we find again and again Pissotto, he's not necessarily challenging the veracity of Offred's story, but he's challenging the facts and information and the interest almost in it. So he states that she wouldn't have had access to any of the materials. And then he continues, "Also, there is a certain reflective quality about the narrative that to my mind would rule out synchronicity." And he talks about the reflective nature that makes it seem like it's written in hindsight. And then he says, "It has a whiff of emotion recollected, if not in tranquility, at least post facto," so after the fact. And again, we have this sense of almost irritation by Pissotto at the reflective, emotional quality of this female story. What he is after is facts and information. He wants the political, breakdown. He wants the structure of Gilead. He wants to know who the key players are and what the strategies were and what decisions were taken by whom when. He's not interested in Offred's reflections on any of the details of her life. And you'll notice as we go through the rest of this section that actually he regurgitates very few of the details of Offred's life. If we could establish an identity for the narrator, we felt we might well be on the way to an explanation of how this document, let me call it that for the sake of brevity, came into being. To do this, we tried 2 lines of investigation. So they've decided that in order to find out the identity of the narrator, that would at least help them work out whether it's true or not. And so they have these 2 strategies that they choose. First, we attempted through old town plans of Bangor and other remaining documentation to identify the inhabitants of the house, which must have occupied the site of the discovery at about that time. Possibly, we reasoned this house may have been a safe house on the underground female road during our period, and our author may have been kept hidden in, for instance, an attic or a cellar there for some weeks or months, during which she would have had the opportunity to make the recordings. And we have this reference here to a way station on the underground female road. Sort of hints here are also of the diary of Anne Frank, but again the casual attitude with which Pisotto discusses it. She might have been hidden there at great peril both to all of the people in the resistance involved and herself, but he makes it seem like she's on a little holiday where she would have had time to complete these recordings. Of course, there was nothing to rule out the possibility that the tapes had been moved to the site in question after they had been made. We hoped to be able to trace and locate the descendants of the hypothetical occupants, whom we hoped might lead us to other material, diaries perhaps, or even family anecdotes passed down through the generations. Unfortunately, this trail led nowhere. And again, we're reminded that so much of our discussion of history and the past is based on very limited source material, but also a great deal of assumption. And there is a great deal of evidence that's from the story itself, but the things that Pisotto wants, he's not interested in the evidence in the story. Possibly these people, if they had been indeed a link in the underground chain, had been discovered and arrested, in which case any documentation referring to them would have been destroyed. And again, this kind of scientific, clinical dealing with the human tragedy and the human sacrifice. And again, we're reminded of Moira's story and the period of time that she spent in the way stations on the underground, and the great sacrifice of people to help the handmaids escape. So we pursued our second line of attack. We searched the records of the period, trying to correlate known historical personages with the individuals who appear in our author's account. And so we have history here, historical personages, and of course history, as we know, tells the story of the people in power, and it's often shaped by people in power. And so we begin to get to the point where the value of Offred's narrative is being reduced. The surviving records of the time are spotty, as the Gileadian regime was in the habit of wiping its own computers and destroying printouts after various purges and internal upheavals, but some printouts remain, and that's just a hint there of Stalin and the purges and the deletion and destruction and the creation of the unpeople or the unperson. Some indeed were smuggled to England for propaganda use by the various Save the Women societies, which there were many of which there were many in the British Isles at that time. And of course, that's again has been kind of stolen, this name from Save the Children. And as we go through this, there is a continual reminder that nothing in Gilead is original. There is no creation within the regime that is sparked from the regime and its ideology itself. And we are, as readers, challenged then to draw parallels between the world that we live in and society, politics and ideology that we experience on a day-by-day basis, and then the roots and the energies that gave rise to Gilead, to see whether we find similar threads. We held out no hope of tracing the narrator herself directly. It was clear from internal evidence that she was among the first wave of women recruited for reproductive purposes and allotted to those who both required such services and could lay claim to them through their position in the elite. And again, just consider here the callous way in which Offred and the experience of the handmaids is discussed here. So we have the first wave of women recruited for reproductive services. The regime created an instant pool of such women by the simple tactic of declaring all second marriages and non-marital liaisons adulterous, arresting the female partners and, on the grounds that they were morally unfit, confiscating the children they already had, who were adopted by childless couples in the upper echelons who were eager for progeny by any means. And again, the kind of clarity and concision that's used here to reduce what we have understood to be very personal human tragedy. In the middle period, this policy was extended to cover all marriages not contracted within the state church. Men highly placed in the regime were thus able to pick and choose among women who had demonstrated their reproductive fitness by having produced one or more healthy children, as a desirable characteristic in an age of plummeting Caucasian birth rates, a phenomenon observable not only in Gilead but in most of the northern Caucasian societies. And you remember from the earlier section, we note that one of the interesting things about Gilead is that the world map was redrawn, and here we get a little bit more information. And of course, in the 1980s, it was a phenomenon in North America and in Europe that there was called what was referred to as a birth dearth, and we have falling rates of fertility and falling birth rates. And so it appears now that the Caucasian race is no longer the majority, and it implies that birth rates are not dropping in other racial or ethnic groups. And so now then Caucasian begin to get to the point of being a minority. And here again, for those of us that when we've looked at eugenics and all of that sort of thing, we consider here some of the roots of some of the nationalistic racist policies that were established in European countries, fascism, all of those things that lead to something that isn't quite Gilead but has many of the hallmarks of Gilead. The reasons behind this decline is not altogether clear to us. Some of the failure to reproduce can undoubtedly be traced to the widespread availability of birth control of various kinds, including abortion, in the immediate pre-Gilead period. Some infertility then was willed, as in decision, which may account for the different statistics among Caucasians and non-Caucasians, but the rest was not. And then we have this kind of this list of the facts around the genesis of Gilead. And we'll remember that Pesoto's already talked about the very cultural specific reasons why Gilead came about, and that being a reason why history shouldn't pass judgment on it. And of course, Offred herself says context is all. And so as we read this little section, as readers, we are again challenged to compare which of these catalysts that were part of the rise of Gilead are also part of our present, and whether then we shouldn't be opening our eyes a little bit more for the politics and ideologies that are on the rise in our country. So he says, need I remind you that this was the age of the R strain syphilis, which of course is a sexually transmitted disease that and also the infamous AIDS epidemic, which once they spread to the population at large eliminated many young sexually active people from the reproductive pool. Stillbirths, miscarriages and genetic deformities were widespread and on the increase. And this trend has been linked to various nuclear accidents. And of course, we've talked about 3 Mile Island and to a certain extent, Atwood's ability to be enormously prophetic with the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl happening, kind of a year, 2 years after the publication of the novel. Shutdowns and incidents of sabotage that characterised the period, as well as leakages from chemical and biological warfare stockpiles and toxic waste disposal sites, of which there were many thousands, both legal and illegal, and in some instances these materials were simply dumped into the sewage system, and the uncontrolled use of chemical insecticides, herbicides and sprays. And in terms of contextual comparisons, all of these things were prevalent in North America in the 1980s, and we've looked at the kind of rivers of fire in California where chemicals were dumped straight into the rivers, which of course were used for water, and in the heat the chemicals themselves would catch fire. And so all of this is fact. The regime then is growing out of something that is the reality for many people. But whatever the causes, the effects were noticeable, and the Gilead regime was not the only one to react to them at the time. Romania, for instance, had anticipated Gilead in the 80s by banning all forms of birth control, imposing compulsory pregnancy tests on the female population, and linking promotion and wages to increases in fertility. And of course, this is the regime from the late 1960s by Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, and the various decrees, of which many of the ones specifically regarding the handmaid's body, including the kind of monthly checks by the doctor, come from. The need for what I may call birth services, and again we have this sense of in a literal sense, the commodification of the female body. She's been turned into a commodity, and that continues in Pesoto's narrative. In studying this era, he's picked up some of the bias of language. So the need for what I may call birth services was already recognised in the pre-Gilead period, where it was being made inadequately met by artificial insemination, fertility clinics and the use of surrogate mothers, who were hired for that purpose. Gilead outlawed the first 2 as irreligious, but legitimised and enforced the third, which was considered to have biblical precedence. They thus replaced serial polygamy, common in the pre-Gilead period, and so that's the serial polygamy, so monogamy is to have a single partner. Polygamy then would be normally talked about to have multiple partners, but the serial then creates it in a line, so to have multiple marriages, one after the other. So they replace serial polygamy, which was common, with an older form of simultaneous polygamy, practiced both in the early Old Testament times and in the former state of Utah, which of course is the Mormons, in the 19th century. As we know from the study of history, no new system can impose itself on a previous one without incorporating many of the elements to be found in the latter, as was witnessed to the pagan elements of the medieval Christianity, which is all of those things like the Harvest Festival and the birth of Jesus being celebrated at Christmas time, replacing the pagan winter festivals, and the evolution of the Russian KGB from the Tsarist secret service that preceded it. And Gilead was no exception to this rule. Its racist policies, for instance, were firmly rooted in the pre-Gilead period. Racist fears provided some of the emotional fuel that allowed the Gilead takeover to succeed as well as it did. And of course we have a real blow there to the ideology of North America in the 1980s, that actually this racism and this kind of increasing approach towards nationalism gives the emotional fuel to Gilead. Our author then was one of many, and must be seen within the broad outlines of a moment in history of which she was a part. But what else can we know about her, apart from her age and some physical characteristics that could be anyone's, and her place of residence? Not very much. She appears to have been an educated woman, insofar as a graduate from any North American college of the time may be said to have been educated. And we have laughter and groans from the audience. So we have this kind of this view from history, this negative view from history of the true value of American university education. But the woods, as they say, are full of these, and so this is no help. She does not see fit to supply us with her original name, and again we have that sense of his irritation, and indeed all official records of it would have been destroyed upon her entry into the Rachel and Leah Re-Education Centres, which is the Red Centre. Offred gives no clue, since Offglen and Off-Warren, it was a patronymic composed of the possessive preposition and the first name of the gentleman in question. Such names were taken by these women upon their entry into a connection with the household of a specific commander and relinquished by them on leaving it. And we have again this amazing kind of callous understatement of the reality of the handmaid's experience by Pesotto here. So such names were taken by these women, which kind of almost replies their complicity and their choice. And then we have their entry into a connection with the household. And again, that kind of utter understatement of what happens with the regards to the abuse, the physical abuse of the handmaid's experience. And then he says, and relinquished upon leaving it, and just that kind of the hint there, the leavings of the households that we've seen. The other names in the document are equally useless for the purposes of identification and authentication. Of course, that's the only thing that he's interested in, is this kind of these factual, authentic details from Gilead. Luke and Nick drew blanks, as did Moira and Janine. And for us here, there is again a sense of unease as his speech continues, and he uses words like useless and blanks for four of the key influences in Offred's life: Luke, Nick, Moira, Janine. he negates them. Their stories are of no value to him without facts and information that he can rely on. He's not interested in the minute details of individual existence. All he wants then is to use these individuals to substantiate his views about the time period. There is a high probability that these, in any case, were pseudonyms adopted to protect these individuals should the tapes have been discovered. If so, this would substantiate our view that the tapes were made inside the borders of Gilead rather than outside to be smuggled back for use by the Mayday underground. Elimination of the above possibilities left us with one remaining, and of course we now get to this historical personage which he thinks is worth investigating. If we could identify the elusive commander, we felt at least some progress would be made. Now, if we look at the word elusive there, which means, of course, kind of unclear, difficult to discover, that word could be used to describe any of our characters. That sense of being slightly hidden. But the words that are used to describe Offred and Nick and Luke and Moira and Janine are words like useless, blank, appears to have been an educated woman. The commander, this historical person, is treated with this word that is generates curiosity, interest and engagement. And again, we fall into trap of this level of admiration and respect for those in power. And we see Pesotto doing that as we continue through this narrative. We felt at least some progress would have been made. We argued that such a highly placed individual would have probably been a participant in the first of the top secret Sons of Jacob think tanks. And so this is another biblical reference here. Jacob had 12 sons who, as the head of their family households, then became the head of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this is perhaps an indication that this first grouping of men who were the architects, the genesis of Gilead, was consisted of 12 individuals. So at first of the top secret Sons of Jacob think tanks at which the philosophy and social structure of Gilead were hammered out. These were organised shortly after the recognition of the superpower arms stalemate and the signing of the classified spheres of influence accord, which left the superpowers free to deal unencumbered by interference with the growing number of rebellions within their own empires. And for those of you that have looked at things like the Cold War and World War I and II, you'll know about the idea of the spheres of influence and the fact that superpowers have these kind of this set of rules that is applied to them. And here we have this treaty or this agreement that's signed that no one will get involved in any civil unrest. So no external power would become involved in any civil unrest within another superpower. The official records of the Sons of Jacob's meetings were destroyed after the middle period of Gilead, the Great Purge. And of course, we know that Offred is from the early period, the Great Purge of the middle period, which discredited and liquidated a number of the original architects of Gilead. And of course, we recognise that with the end of Offred's story also comes this suspicion that the commander's end, his demise, his downfall is also going to take place. And it's interesting that they're not only discredited but also liquidated, which is a really interesting word to use to describe an individual. We have access to some information through the diary kept in cipher, so code, by Wilfred Limpkin, one of the sociobiologists present. As we know, and this is in brackets, the sociobiology theory of natural polygamy was used as scientific justification for some of the odder practices of the regime, just as Darwinism was used by earlier ideologies. And the reference to Darwinism then is the idea of eugenics being used in Nazi Germany. And here we have this idea. So sociobiology is the scientific discipline that looks at human behaviour through the lens of evolution. And so this might look at the mating habits of pack animals and the idea that you have one dominant male who inseminates a large number of females, and you might then make reference from that to the idea of human behaviour. And what's interesting then is that this is sociobiology, and Wilfred Limpkin was obviously involved in the Sons of Jacob's meetings. Sociobiology is reliant on the idea of evolution, and as we've studied kind of fundamental evangelical Christianity in pre-Gilead America, kind of post-war America, we will know that evolution as an idea is utterly rejected. And as we all know, there are schools and museums that are dedicated to kind of overthrowing anything to do with the idea of evolution, because it doesn't fit with the biblical narrative of God's creation of the world in 7 days. All right, we're just going to read this next little bit, and then the final video will finish the historical notes. From the Limpkin material, we know that there are two possible candidates, that is, two whose names incorporate the element Fred: Frederick R Waterford and B Frederick Judd. No photographs survive of either, although Limpkin describes the latter, that's Judd, as a stuffed shirt, and I quote, "somebody for whom foreplay is what you do on the golf course." And again, we have this laughter, and there's just a reminder of this kind of casual sexism, this jocular sexualized humour that Pesotto has engaged in throughout. And that kind of that sense of the hint there of the demeaning attitude towards the experiences of these women. Limpkin himself did not long survive the inception of Gilead, and we have his diary only because he foresaw his own end and placed it with his sister-in-law in Calgary. Waterford and Judd both have the characteristics that recommend them to us. Waterford possessed a background in market research, and of course we remember the commander talking about that, and was, according to Limpkin, responsible for the design of the female costumes and for the suggestion that the handmaids wear red, which he seems to have borrowed from the uniform of German prisoners of war in Canada, in Canadian POW, so prisoner of war camps, of the Second World War era. And for those of you that don't know, in the Canadian prisoner of war camps, which is where some German prisoners end up, the prisoners had a large red circle on their uniforms. So there are a number of hints here to the fact that Waterford could have been our commander. He seems to have been the originator of the term, the neologism particicution, which he lifted from an exercise program popular sometime in the last third of the century. The collective rope ceremony, however, was suggested by an English village custom of the 17th century. Salvaging may have been his too, although by the time of Gilead's inception, it was spread from its origin in the Philippines, which we've already looked at, to become a general term for the elimination of one's political enemies. And of course, in this then, we have this implicit idea that those that are salvaged in Gilead are political enemies. As I have said elsewhere, there was little that was truly original or indigenous to Gilead, and we have this key quote: its genius was synthesis. And so we have, as we've talked about often before, the idea that there's nothing original in Gilead on purpose. It's the synthesis of so many elements that are reality in history and the world around us that bear the roots that create the regime, and that of course is the cautionary tale that Atwood is challenging us to look at. They synthesize a wide variety of realities. Judd, on the other hand, seems to have been less interested in packaging, so less interested in the external, the propaganda, and more concerned with tactics. It was he who suggested the use of an obscure CIA pamphlet on the destabilization of foreign governments as a strategic handbook for the sons of Jacob. And this is relatively well known from throughout the Cold War era right up until kind of modern military strategy, that the CIA is interested in destabilizing foreign governments in order to secure resources, in order to kind of challenge areas where money or drugs are coming into America, also to, you know, to take out threats. And so we have this kind of, again, so we have this interesting document which is about the destruction of one's enemies being applied to your own society and civilians. He too who drew up the early hit lists of prominent Americans of the time. And so we have this sense of this kind of military man, this violence. He's also suspected of having orchestrated the President's Day massacre, which must have required maximum infiltration of the security system surrounding Congress, and without which the Constitution could never have been suspended. And so we have this very sinister implication of the kind of the depth of not only the conspiracy to create, to overthrow the existing government, but also the violence that individuals will go to. And if we compare the descriptions of Judd to the commander that we know, then we do find him a very uneasy and worrying character. The national homelands and the Jewish boat person plan were both his. So this is this idea of segregation, as was the idea of privatizing the Jewish repatriation scheme, with the result that more than one boatload of Jews was simply dumped in the Atlantic for maximum profits. So we have again this kind of callous disregard for human life, this sense of this white nationalist heritage that we see coming up in belief that we see coming up in America, that they are, you know, giving Jews, as we know, because Offred has given us this information, giving Jews the choice to go home, privatizing it so that people are paying a private company, and then actually, because the payment has been taken, these individuals are dumped in the sea. And of course, Margaret Atwood, writing this in the 1980s, can't jump forward, you know, into the kind of the 20, 30 years into the future to see that that is exactly some of the things that are happening from the kind of Middle East and North Africa in Europe now. From what we know of Judd, this would not have bothered him much. He was a he was a hardliner. This is credited by Limpkin with the remark, "Our biggest mistake was teaching them to read. We won't do that again." And so we have, again, something very familiar to the commander that Offred knows, being put in the mouth of someone who is a brutal hardliner, happy to sacrifice the lives of hundreds of thousands in order to achieve his aims. And we're going to leave it at that. The last section of the historical notes will be in the next video.